Welcome to Dead and Roasted. What can I get you?
I might be the manager here at Dead and Roasted, but if I had to pay someone to work night shift versus the day shift, they're getting a little bit of a bump in pay. A night shift can be lonely and boring, but also far scarier than working during the day. And here at Dead and Roasted, the night shift is full of vampires. Yeah, we rent the upper floor to vampires, and during the night they come rushing in for coffee. Actually, today I've got a brand new set of allegedly true and scary work stories, all about the night shift, which might be our favorite topic here. You're about to hear security guard dread, haunted work locations, and one Lyft driver's absolute worst nightmare. And I'm not even talking about 600-pound nightmares. Before we start, don't forget you can send me your scary work stories at eriecast.com/submit. You can support us by going to eriecast.com/plus and becoming a member, which unlocks access to members-only bonus content and more. And you can help us become the #1 scary podcast in the world by reviewing and following Tales from the Break Room on Apple Podcasts and Spotify. Thank you. These are Tales from the Break Room. Night Shift at Glenwood Hospital. From Olivia. I'd always thought of myself as the kind of person who doesn't scare easily. That self-image changed during my time working the night shift at Glenwood Hospital, a medium-sized facility in a quiet town. The building itself was more than a century old. The more modern wings had been recently added over the years, but the original structure featured high-arched hallways, narrow windows, and walls that sometimes groaned with the shift of old wood. I was used to the usual quirks of night duty. Sometimes the lights would flicker, or the corridors would be eerily quiet. And every so often, maybe the patients would be half asleep or confused or both. None of that prepared me, though, for what happened in the pediatric ward during my last weeks there. I had been assigned to the pediatric night shift about 8 months before this incident. Normally, the ward was subdued in the late hours. Children were either asleep or watched over by concerned parents dozing in chairs. The staff would keep lights dim to maintain that restful atmosphere. One corner of that ward had been cordoned off for months, reserved for repairs we never seemed to finish. Something about the hospital's budget, I guess. Maybe some bureaucratic red tape. But they kept the place sectioned off in limbo. It consisted of 4 old rooms and a narrow storage alcove, shut behind a pair of double doors no one entered. Once or twice I'd caught housekeeping staff opening the doors to stash old equipment, but generally it stayed locked and unlit. One Tuesday night I was charting at the nurse's station around 2 a.m. A coworker of mine, I'll call him Manny, was in the break room grabbing a snack. The ward was silent except for the muted beeping of monitors. But then I heard something else. A soft but insistent knocking on the double doors leading to the closed-off section. I lifted my head, certain I must have misheard. But the sound came again, sharper this time. 3 distinct taps. We rarely had any reason to go in there, and it was supposed to be empty, so any noise from inside was surprising to hear. I stood for a moment, then walked over and called through the door. "Hello? Anyone back there?" Nobody answered. The knock resumed, methodical. I tried shining my phone's flashlight through the wired reinforced glass inset in the doors, but the darkness beyond swallowed up the beam. A chill prickled at the back of my neck. I unlocked the doors and peeked through a tiny gap, calling out a second time. The corridor beyond smelled stale, untouched for ages. I saw no movement, just a cluster of shadows. Feeling creeped out, I locked it again and returned to my station, deciding it was likely some odd settling noises or a loose cart inside. That was the sensible explanation. 15 minutes later, Manny came back, munching on a bag of chips. I told him what happened, expecting him to shrug it off, but instead, He looked surprised. He then admitted that a few nights prior, he'd heard a kid crying from behind those same double doors. But when he went to check, there was only silence. We decided that if it happened again, we would investigate together. But for the rest of the night, no more noises came from the barricaded corridor. The next shift passed without incident, as did the one after that. By Friday, I'd mostly put it out of my mind. Around 3 a.m. that night, I stepped away from the station to do a quick round of the occupied rooms. Parents were asleep. Kids were dozing. Hallways were half lit. Everything felt pretty normal. As I was finishing up, I spotted Manny down the corridor, waving me over with an urgent look on his face. When I came close enough, he whispered that he'd heard faint giggling near the double doors again and went to investigate. This time the doors were unlocked, when he was certain that he had locked them up not an hour ago. I remember audibly gulping then. We looked at each other like, we're gonna have to check this out together, huh? Manny gently pushed the doors open and I followed him, holding my phone flashlight. The corridor ahead was dark. I could see dust drifting through the beam of my flashlight. The air was cold enough to raise goosebumps on my arms, or maybe it was just the atmosphere. We stepped forward, walking past the first 2 empty rooms, which had torn wallpaper and taped up windows. As Manny swung his flashlight around, I glimpsed a child's wheelchair in the corner, one that I didn't recall seeing before. The seat and headrest looked brand new, completely out of place amid the abandoned atmosphere. Then I heard a giggle. It was soft and playful, echoing from the far end of the hallway, near the storage alcove. I nearly choked on my own breath. "Who's there?" Manny whisper-shouted. We continued to go forward. The hallway ended in a small nook where battered storage carts were left, collecting dust. But I didn't see anyone. The closet door was ajar, though. Manny carefully swung it open. The closet was lined with metal shelves jammed with ancient boxes of supplies. Nothing about it really seemed out of place, except for a single shoe, a little black Mary Jane placed in the middle of the floor. And, just like the wheelchair, it looked brand new. Manny picked up the shoe and turned it over. Then he looked at me and frowned. Its inside label was pristine, not a scuff mark in sight. We knew the entire floor's pediatric patients. None of them had lost a shoe that looked like this. Then, suddenly, a breeze blew by us, impossibly cold. It seemed to rush through the closet. It gave me a chill. Manny was startled, and he dropped the shoe. I felt nauseous by then. The two of us stepped back, and we decided we were done. We locked up the alcove, and we left that corridor, double-locking the doors again. We would just alert maintenance in the morning that something was off back there. Later that night in bed, I stayed awake a little longer, thinking about things. My rational mind was insisting we must have stumbled upon old equipment or items housekeeping left behind, maybe a mislaid wheelchair or something. But that giggle and the chill and the shoe suggested something else, something that didn't align with any normal hospital logistics. Over the next few nights, Manny and I avoided that part of the ward. We did hear sounds still, footsteps and I swear laughter at one point. So we kept away. We focused on our patient responsibilities, hoping if we didn't pay attention to it, it would leave us be. Apparently, that's not how it worked, because instead, it seemed to get worse. One night, the monitors in the pediatric room started to flicker. The electronics read bizarre data or abruptly reset to factory settings. The staff had to spend hours recalibrating things. This is a hospital. That kind of stuff can't be malfunctioning, because it could get dangerous. Tech support claimed the hospital's old wiring was causing surges, but between me and Manny, he had a more paranormal explanation for it. The next night, a father of a young boy with appendicitis asked me if we kept toy balls in the hallway, because he saw a small ball rolling on its own past his door. I told him no, the kids didn't typically have free-floating toys out in the corridors. He looked freaked out. Finally, Manny and I planned to go in again, more thoroughly. In fact, he brought a huge actual flashlight, not just a phone flashlight. So one Saturday, after management had brushed off our maintenance requests as not a priority, we went back in. The idea was we would quickly inspect each empty room in the closed corridor, document anything unusual, and leave. If we found some sign of trespassers or animals, we'd show the evidence to the hospital administration. If we found something else, well, we'd cross that bridge, you know. Just after midnight, we made our move. The ward was quiet. Our few patients were stable, and the on-call doctor was napping in his office. We snuck to the double doors, discovering to our dismay that they were already unlocked again. The corridor was dimly lit by emergency exit signs, giving us at least some faint visibility. The first room, there were battered stretchers, a broken lamp, peeling paint, no signs of footprints or people. Second room, a rusted bed frame, a curtain rod lying on the floor, stains on the walls that might have been water damage. So far, so good, I guessed. When we reached the third room, Manny froze. I peered around him and saw something. Reflecting the bright flashlight, there was that child's wheelchair again. It stood in the center of the room now. A swirl of dust hung in the air around it, enough to make me think someone had been moving around only moments ago. I stepped into the room. The wheelchair's vinyl seat had a cushion, and on that cushion sat the missing shoe. I nearly dropped my phone. That wasn't where we had left the shoe. I heard Manny mutter a curse. We heard a scratching noise and realized it was coming from the far wall, partially stripped of plaster. It sounded like nails scraping across the exposed wood. Manny pointed the light, but we saw only the wall, chipped and dusty. But I swear we saw something scuttle from behind a corner then, too fast to see clearly, but definitely small and hunched over. It rapidly disappeared through the door into the fourth room. Instinctively, we both shouted, "Hey!" and rushed after it. The fourth room turned out to be the darkest, with a large boarded-up window. As we entered, Manny's light flickered, then died altogether. I remember him muttering something about brand new batteries, so all we had now was my phone's flashlight. We scoured the room. There was an abandoned IV stand tipped over on its side, and a single painting hung crookedly, a childish watercolor of a meadow. The scuttling thing we saw before was nowhere to be seen. For a moment, I swear I heard more giggling again, very faint if it was there. Despite the stillness, and now mostly quiet, the sense of a presence being with us was overwhelming. When the watercolor painting fell off the wall, I nearly died of a heart attack. Manny screamed like a little kid. We turned around and saw nothing else moving. After a few seconds, I walked over to the painting to pick it up, but then Manny said, "I think we should just leave." He was shaken up. I didn't argue with him. We hurried out of the room, through the corridor, past the wheelchair and shoe, and out the double doors. Manny locked them up again. Then we both ran back to the nurse's station. The following day, we did officially report what we'd experienced, possibly citing a trespasser, safety concerns, weird noises. But we didn't make anything sound supernatural, just objective facts. A few days later, we learned that a small crew had been assigned to clear out that old section for good. Manny and I could finally breathe freely again. We thought that would be the end of it. I transferred to a different unit the following week, so I never did see the outcome firsthand. But Manny did text me about a month after that, saying, "They emptied the corridor, found random old gear. Maintenance sealed it off for good, too. Sometimes, though, I swear I hear a laugh still. Then, not long after that, I left the hospital for good, soon working at a different location entirely. I'm not going to sit here and tell you I know exactly what's going on with that hospital, but I do completely believe it's not just faulty wiring. I think there's some sort of entity there, or maybe a sort of conscious or subconscious collection of children's pain. I mean, that ward has seen children come and go. Sometimes the ones that leave aren't always the lucky ones. Reality is harsh that way. The Grocery Shenanigans, from Hank L. The grocery store I work at is not a big box chain place. It's a family-run store in an older section of our town, one that used to bustle decades ago, but modern times are really starting to catch up. By the time I was hired, foot traffic at the place had dwindled, especially at night, but they still kept the place open 24 hours. We usually had just a skeleton crew. One cashier, usually me, a stock guy, and a single manager on call. The nights were pretty dull. Most customers were blary-eyed insomniacs grabbing milk or cigarettes. I would pass the hours wiping the counter and restocking candy bars. And if I wasn't being watched and there was nothing to do, I'd do something on my phone. One autumn, they brought in fresh produce from a local orchard. Apples, pumpkins, squash. For some reason, the produce manager stacked the displays in a tall, narrow arrangement near the front. I always worried the tower of fruit would topple over, but it somehow stayed balanced. I remember that detail clearly, and you'll soon know why. A couple of nights in a row, I noticed that the produce display looked disturbed. Squash scattered, pumpkins shifted, apples rolled away. I asked our stock guy, Carter, if he was rearranging them himself. He insisted he wasn't. Our manager, Della, brushed it off as probably bored teens messing around. That was plausible, but the store's security cams didn't show any meddling. We rarely got more than a handful of nighttime customers. How would they manage that without being seen or heard? Things escalated on a Tuesday when I was behind the register, around 1:30 a.m. Carter was on break. Della was in the back office. A thunderstorm raged outside, illuminating the aisles whenever lightning struck. The store was otherwise empty. Then I heard a soft scuffling sound, like someone sliding their feet on the tile floor. I leaned over the register to get a better look. I saw a figure slip between the aisles, near the produce. I called out but didn't get a response. Just continued movement with the odd shuffling. I flipped on a switch to brighten the overhead lights in that corner of the store. The illumination revealed a figure crouched among the pumpkins. It was tall but stooped over, wearing drab and dirty clothes that hung off of it like tattered sacks. Their face was partly obscured by the display. However, I caught sight of its eyes when it turned, wide and glinting. It sprang up then, scattering the pumpkins. I instinctively ducked behind the register. By the time I looked again, it was gone, and all that remained was a half-collapsed produce tower and a rolling apple spinning in place. I walked over, looking up and down the aisles. No sign of our intruder. Della came rushing from the back, demanding to know what the commotion was about. I gave her the best description of the events as I could. She glanced around, saw the mess, and looked upset. "Probably a homeless person looking for shelter," she guessed. The store had a locked entrance, though, and nobody had come in the front. The idea of someone sneaking in through a back door gave me the creeps. We checked the loading area, the bathrooms, anywhere else our guest may have hidden. Nothing. Eventually, we had to continue working, practically forced to shrug it off as a one-time occurrence, even though evidence said otherwise. The remainder of that night was quiet. but I did look over my shoulder an untold number of times. A week after that, I was less and less creeped out by the events. It was now just a bizarre thing that happened at the store one day. That night, Carter felt too sick to come in, so it would be just me and Della again. Around midnight, there was heavy rain outside. We had a single customer, a middle-aged woman in a coat. She left after buying a 6-pack of soda. Then the store was empty save for us. I kept myself busy straightening some candy racks. That's when I heard something metallic clattering in the back aisles, somewhere near the deli. I jumped. Then there was another noise, that metal scraping noise I'd heard before. "Della?" I said, but she answered from the office sounding annoyed with me. "What?" Well, that meant she wasn't the one rummaging around near the deli. I walked toward the deli section, honestly feeling a bit nervous. Between rows of shelving, I found a puddle of water, apparently formed from a leak in the ceiling, something that we needed to get fixed. But then I noticed there were footprints leading out of the water. Long, narrow, and wet footprints. It was then that I spotted the shape again. It stood partially hidden behind the open door of the deli meat cooler. It turned its head slowly, and I saw some crazy-looking eyes reflecting the overhead lights. My body went stiff as a board. The shape seemed taller than before. Its thin arms were draped in ragged cloth. This time I remember focusing on the thing's hands. I got a good look at them. They were long and thin, with fingers that were bent oddly and spindly. The thing or person's posture was contorted, like it had always been hunched, or maybe it was forced to stay concealed. I didn't know what I was looking at. I had to assume it was some sort of drugged-out hobo. So I said, "Sir, you can't be back here. We're closed off in that section." But they made no sound. Instead, they stepped out of sight behind the cooler. I edged closer, ignoring everything in me that was telling me to run. There came a rattling sound from behind the deli counter, and suddenly the power went out. No, probably not paranormal if you're thinking that. More than likely the storm. Every time it rained here even a decent amount, we had power issues. So only the emergency lights at that point near the entrance and the sporadic lightning outside gave me any visual. I heard footsteps, rapid and far too heavy sounding for that thin-looking frame I saw before. Then there was the shattering of glass, maybe a jar or a display case. I scrambled for my flashlight, aiming it all around like mad. Lightning flashed, and I glimpsed the figure, bounding toward the back exit. Now, I know it was probably just some crazy, weird-looking person, but I swear it looked half human and half something else. Its limbs weren't bent in the right ways, but it was gone before I could get a better view. Della came out, cursing about the lights. By the time we got the generator running, there was no trace of that intruder, except for the spilled jars and those strange wet footprints, which led all the way up to the back door exit, which was now slightly ajar. We called the police. They did a quick search of the perimeter in the rain, but found nothing, and told us to double-check and double-lock up. And that was it. Della was creeped out, and for the first time she looked like she actually believed my story about something creeping through the store. Over the next few nights, we noticed smaller incidents, like misplaced or missing items, like some stuff here and there being knocked over, along with occasional muddy footprints. When Carter was back, he joked about it being a gremlin. Maybe he thought it was funny, but he hadn't seen it close up yet. Well, I guess I hadn't either, but I'd seen it. A feral hobo, or this so-called gremlin. The final encounter was what convinced me that what haunted that grocery store was no simple intruder. Near the end of my shift around 4 a.m., I was organizing magazines by the entrance. Della had to go home early with a migraine. Poor girl suffered from cluster headaches and migraines frequently. So I was the only staff there. Carter, of course, was gone again. The store was dead quiet. I was jumpy as heck. Rain was dripping from the gutters outside. Yes, it rains a lot here. Out of nowhere, the motion-activated lights in aisle 7 switched on. Someone had walked past. I was nowhere near there, so it couldn't have been me. I tried to remain calm, but my hands were starting to shake. I had to go that way, just to check it out. As I rounded the corner, I saw that the aisles were empty. Just shelves of canned goods. The lights in aisle 8 then flickered on. That feeling of dread in me continued to rise. Every second that passed, I felt less and less alone, and I didn't think it was a customer. I remember I took a deep breath and slowly approached aisle 8. I rounded the corner. No one there. Then aisle 9's lights turned on. Was it messing with me? I wondered. Was the storm causing weird power issues again? I kept going. By the time I reached aisle 9, I'd had enough. I called out, "Is someone in here?" It was quiet at first, but I did hear a dripping sound. I turned around and spotted water pooling on the floor again, but this water looked very dirty. It had a brackish tinge. Again, probably not something paranormal, but it didn't help my creepy situation. I decided to go back up to the front, which turned out to be a bad idea, because where I'd seen it the first time, at the produce, I saw it again. The produce display was half empty at this hour, with only a few pumpkins and wilted lettuce, but for some reason it smelled heavily of wet soil. And then I saw mud on the floor. It took me a moment, because it was barely noticeable, but I saw it. Something crouched just barely behind the display of produce. Before I got a good look, it stood up. It happened over the course of about 2 seconds. It stood to a height way taller than myself, but I was so horrified that I was already turning around, running and screaming for my life. I ran all the way to the manager's office and locked myself in, but moments before I even got there, the exit door slammed shut. That meant a couple of things. First, the thing was gone. But second, it was fast enough to run past me and get out through the exit door before I was even close to the manager's office. That would be my last shift at the grocery store. I quit the following morning. No call, no show. Management did try to call me, but I ignored it. To this day, I still don't know what it was. But if you ask me, personally, it wasn't human. Something lived in the nearby area and saw free food through the glass panes of that grocery store. And when customers slowed down and things appeared quiet, it took a moment to grab a pumpkin or two and maybe some sliced ham. The Smoke Break, from Bobby. Back in 2017, my dad forced me out of the house when I was just 17. He'd remarried, and his new wife had no interest in having a teenage stepson around. There wasn't a big fight or anything dramatic. He simply handed me some cash and told me to figure things out on my own. I remember cramming my clothes into a trash bag and feeling my face burn with shame as I waited for a friend to pick me up. That was the day my real adult life began. For the next year, I scraped by on part-time jobs, stocking shelves at a grocery store, washing dishes in a dingy restaurant, you name it. I managed to finish high school in a cramped studio apartment with no real support. Each day felt like a treadmill I couldn't step off, but I forced myself forward. After graduation, I tried a few odd trade programs, mostly in mechanics, but the full-time positions never stuck. Eventually, I discovered rideshare driving. I needed flexibility, and driving for Lyft gave me that. It paid my rent, especially if I worked through the night when surge fares popped up. A couple of years into that routine, I moved closer to Northern California, near Redwood National and State Parks. I won't say the exact city or roadways, but you've probably heard of that region. Towering redwood forests, damp mossy ground, roads that twist around giant trunks like a scene from some ancient story. It was mesmerizing compared to the dull suburbia I grew up in. Driving tourists around was actually fun for me. They'd marvel at the scenery, and I'd agree that it was breathtaking. But since Redwood includes several parks and protected areas, there were also secluded entrances I liked to frequent for a quick break. One particular state park access gate stood out to me. A small gravel clearing just off a narrow road, thick trees forming a dark arch beyond the locked gate. Perfect for a quiet smoke or to stretch my legs when rides were slow. I was 20 or 21 when it happened. It was mid-October, slightly chilly at night, so I kept the windows rolled up while driving. Around 1 in the morning, I decided to take a break. I often scheduled that break around then, because by 2 or 3, there might be a small rush of bar closings in the area. I turned down the familiar winding road leading to the park entrance. The traffic was non-existent at that hour, and most folks were asleep behind locked doors. I remember thinking the moon was bright, though I could only see slivers of it through the high canopy. I pulled into the small gravel spot, killed the engine, and got out with a cigarette. It was utterly still, aside from a distant breeze rustling the treetops. Beyond the closed park gate was a short footpath that led into darkness. I stood near my car, smoking, leaning against the driver's side door. I'd done this dozens of times, never had a real problem. At worst, a wandering raccoon might startle me. But that night, I heard a sudden snap, a crisp break of a branch that sounded forceful, deliberate. Instantly, every hair on my arms stood up. I'd heard twigs snapping before, but that one felt heavy. I tried to ignore it, telling myself deer or coyotes were common here. But then came a second snap, slightly higher in pitch. The forest was quiet except for those measured cracks. Exhaling a final puff, I flicked the cigarette to the ground, crushed it under my foot, and listened. Another snap. This time it sounded like it came from somewhere above ground level. A raccoon climbing a tree? Maybe. But something about the spacing was strange, like it was moving between branches, not just stepping on them. All at once, a deep, wet clicking noise echoed from inside the trees. It had a throaty resonance, like someone clacking their tongue in the back of their mouth, but amplified. My gut clenched. I turned on the flashlight feature of my phone, aiming the weak beam into the darkness. Under that canopy, the light barely penetrated. Still, I could see the first few feet of the brush, tall ferns, and the massive trunks. Nothing moved at ground level, but the next snap sounded from above, maybe 15 feet up. Against better judgment, I walked a few cautious steps forward, phone held high. The beam caught the rough texture of redwood bark, the thick coil of branches overhead. Then something shifted. Just a sliver of motion in the treetops, a shadow upon shadows. My phone shook in my grip, and I strained my eyes, trying to distinguish a shape. There, perched on a thick branch, was a silhouette that didn't match any animal I'd ever seen. It looked roughly human-sized, maybe bigger, but crouched, limbs bent close. I froze, my light wavering along the bark. For a moment, I thought I glimpsed 2 reflective spots that could have been eyes. Black, oily eyes that stared straight back at me. My lungs tightened. I wanted to run, but my legs seemed glued to the spot. The shape on the branch cocked its head, and a new series of clicks, louder, more insistent, echoed. My phone beam flickered across what might have been its arm or a leg. It was so fast and fluid. Then it leaned forward, and I heard the creaking of wood as if it shifted its weight. I stumbled backward, heart racing. The moment I moved, it skittered along the branch, silent but for a scuttling friction on the bark. A surge of panic finally set me in motion. I turned and bolted back toward my car. Twigs and gravel crunched beneath my feet in a frenzied scramble. My ears strained for any sign of pursuit, but all I registered was a high, almost guttural clicking that sounded closer now. Then the tree line behind me exploded with a loud crack like a trunk splitting. Glancing back, I saw the silhouette in a blur, climbing or leaping from one tree to another. The movement was impossibly swift. I yanked open the driver's door, half diving onto the seat. My hands shook as I jammed the key into the ignition. The car took a second to turn over, felt like an eternity. Out of the corner of my eye, I saw a thick branch overhead tilt, sagging dangerously. Wood groaned and snapped. The entire chunk of tree broke free and came crashing down, bouncing off other branches on its way. I slammed the accelerator in a blind panic. The branch smashed down onto the gravel, part of it smashing into my trunk with a brutal impact. My rear window cracked in a spiderweb pattern, and I heard the trunk crumple. Wheels screeching, I careened out of that spot, practically fishtailing onto the narrow road. In the rearview mirror, all I saw was darkness and a massive piece of broken branch lying across the clearing. A fleeting shape moved in the upper canopy, though I could barely make it out through the shattered glass. My pulse roared in my ears, and I gripped the wheel so tight my knuckles turned white. Once I reached a main road, I forced myself to slow down, heart still hammering. I kept checking the mirror as if expecting that creature to burst from the trees, chasing me at impossible speeds. That's how jumpy I was. Eventually, I spotted the lights of a late-night gas station. Under the lights, I got out and saw the damage. Bark chips clinging to my trunk, a huge dent near the rear windshield, glass cracks. I couldn't wrap my head around how close I'd come to being pinned under that branch. If I'd hesitated even 10 seconds more, I might not have made it out. I spent the rest of the night at home, staring at the ceiling. My mind wouldn't stop replaying that silhouette, those black eyes that seemed to reflect my phone's light, and the clicking, like a predatory language I wasn't meant to hear. My phone had no footage of it, just one blurry photo I must have taken on accident. A swirl of leaves and half my shoe, as if captured mid-run. No sign of the thing in the trees. Over the next few days, I tried to come up with a rational explanation. A bear maybe, though black bears aren't common in that exact area, and they sure don't climb with such eerie grace. A cougar could climb, but cougars don't normally make a rapid clicking noise, and they don't usually try to drop branches onto cars. Maybe it was a diseased, starving creature, or some local weirdo who lived out there. Yet the shape was too strange, too agile, and the eyes too reflective. I kept driving for Lyft, of course. I had no choice, but I never took my brakes in that spot again. Whenever I neared the park or dropped a passenger off near the forest, I felt an unpleasant chill. If they wanted me to wait for them, I politely refused. I didn't mention a creature or a chase, I just said I was in a hurry. Sometimes, driving by those towering redwoods, I'd catch myself peering upward through the windshield, scanning the branches even at midday. One evening, I encountered a park ranger at a local diner. I gathered my courage to ask if he'd seen anything unusual. He spoke of bears, bobcats, mountain lions. None of it matched what I saw. I mentioned weird clicking noises, and he gave a half smile, insisting cougars sometimes made odd calls. But the conversation fizzled when he noticed my unease. He didn't sound like he believed in anything beyond normal forest wildlife. I can't say I believe any folklore, legend, or myth that could explain it, but I can't ignore what I experienced. The redwood forests are ancient and dense. There might be more to them than we understand. Eventually, I moved to another region, continuing my rideshare gig. The Redwood area remains one of the most striking places I've ever been. Beautiful by day, but harrowing in certain corners of the night. I am just grateful I made it out unscathed, aside from the cracked window and the memory I can't shake. To anyone who wanders off the main roads in those woods, keep your eyes open, especially upward. And if you hear that low, throaty clicking, don't hang around to find out what's making it. I sure as heck won't. Overnight security. From Anonymous. I was the guy that thought working a security guard job would be fun and give me a lot of time to myself, especially if I got a gig overnight. Luckily for me at the time, I was able to secure such a position. I worked overnight security for a 22-story office high-rise building in the downtown area of a certain city in a certain state that will remain anonymous. My job was pretty simple. I would watch the security desk from 10 p.m. to 6 a.m. I would do 2 patrols, one at midnight and one at 3 a.m., and I would handle any late-night emergencies, which there were very few of. The building had an extensive camera system. Lobbies, hallways, stairwells, even some of the offices. Over time, I developed a routine. Check each feed, note any movement, greet the rare cleaning crew or executive who stays late. Then just go back to sipping some coffee and reading a magazine. I started to notice some things a month into my assignment. Small things at first. One time, a camera feed on the 14th floor corridor blinked out for a moment, then came back. The night after that, a motion alarm tripped on the 9th floor, but when I reviewed the footage, the hallway was empty. During patrols, I'd sometimes sense a presence behind me, only to turn and see nothing but shadows cast by exit signs. I chalked it up to the building just being old, but if I've learned one thing from this, is that you shouldn't always just dismiss your feelings like this as simply nothing. Around that time, my coworker who handled the day shift casually mentioned that the 15th floor had a weird vibe. That's how he put it. He'd heard rumors that the floor once housed a questionable startup that went bankrupt abruptly, leaving behind abandoned offices and half-finished expansions. The entire wing of the 15th floor was vacant, and pretty spooky. For whatever reason, that wing never had any lights on, so it was pitch black compared to the rest of the building. I rarely had to go there, thankfully, but I never did forget my coworker's weird vibes comment. On a late Thursday, I was looking at camera feeds at the security desk, sipping some stale coffee. The monitor for the 15th floor hallway suddenly flickered. I looked closer. A person seemed to move from left to right, just at the edge of the corridor. The camera resolution wasn't great, but it was enough to trigger the motion sensor. An intruder, I thought. Made my stomach tighten up. I toggled the feed to enlarge the image, but whoever they were gone, and everything was still again. I went to check it out. I took the elevator up, looking around each hallway carefully, and I was completely on guard. All seemed quiet, the rows of closed office doors and buzzing lights. I soon made it to the corridor leading to that vacant wing. The closer I got, the more anxious I felt. I had my flashlight out, ready for the pitch darkness of that area. I stepped into the dark wing, and I noticed the air smelled odd here. There was an emergency light providing a faint glow near the far wall, revealing some half-removed wallpaper and industrial carpeting that had been partially torn up. I took my time. The idea that the intruder, if there was one, could be hiding anywhere kept me on my toes. I checked each room. Most were bare, containing random office furniture or piles of discarded paperwork. Nothing jumped out at me. I didn't find any signs of forced entry. I felt relieved. Maybe I'd seen some sort of weird glitch in the camera. As I turned to leave, someone whispered. I couldn't tell what it said, but it was certainly a human whispering. I felt goosebumps all over me, and I jumped and turned in an instant. I called out at the same time. "Hello?" The sound had no clear direction, or maybe it happened so fast I didn't get a chance to tell. I took a deep breath and said, "Security, you shouldn't be in here." Everything was quiet. I began to back away, craving to be back in the light, but I stopped again when I heard sobbing. I had a thought at that moment that's funny when I look back on it, but the thought was, are you freaking kidding me? Strange figures, whispers in the dark. Of course something would start sobbing in the dark. I could tell where this sound was coming from, since it was continuous. It led me to a corner office where half the door was missing. Inside was somehow darker than dark. I pushed the remains of the door open. Inside, there were papers all over the floor, a broken swivel chair on its side. The sobbing was clearer now. Whoever was crying, they were in here. I took another step, and as if someone had flicked a switch, everything went quiet. The sobbing stopped. It was so sudden that I held my breath. I spoke again. "I heard you. If you're in here, you need to show yourself." Of course, there was no response. After about 2 minutes, I turned back towards the hallway. But when I did, I nearly dropped my flashlight. A silhouette stood about 20 feet away, near the intersection of corridors. A human-shaped figure, but very still, and I wondered if they were watching me. I wanted to call out then, but it felt like my vocal cords had seized up. The figure began to move then, stepping just out of my view. I regathered myself, and I hurried to the intersection, shining my light in every direction, but there was no longer any sign of anyone. I left the 15th floor after that. My gut told me I'd just encountered something beyond a typical trespasser. Over the next week, the camera on that floor kept glitching. At least I hope it was glitches. Motion sensors seemed to beep randomly. Sometimes when I reviewed the footage, I would see fleeting glimpses of movement again in that same hallway. Never enough to identify a person, but always enough to unnerve me. My second confrontation happened about a week later. I was on a 3 a.m. patrol. The building was deserted at the time, as usual. I stepped out of the elevator onto the 15th floor, preparing myself for another nerve-wracking pass. This time I heard footsteps the moment I stepped out of the elevator. These were slow and careful steps coming from the darkness of the wing. I aimed my light around. The hallway was empty, yet the footsteps continued. I could hear echoes of them bouncing off the walls, like an invisible someone was walking around. I walked further into the hallway, which soon brought me into the vacant wing. The footsteps seemed to stop near a door that looked as if it led to an old former conference room, and then I saw something creepy. The handle to the door began to jiggle, and I swear at the same time, the air around me got colder. I waited for the jiggling to stop. I then swallowed hard, went up to the door, and pressed my ear against it. I thought I'd hear more footsteps or someone giggling, trying to hide, but what I heard instead was scratching, like someone's nails on drywall. Honestly, in that moment, I'd never been so scared, but I twisted the handle anyway, knowing that this was my job. It opened smoothly, revealing a dark and windowless room. The scratching immediately stopped. Something about the dark in there felt wrong. I looked around, searching every inch of that space. There was a battered conference table in the middle, a row of chairs in disrepair and more scattered papers. I rubbed my eyes, which had begun to water just from the fear alone. At the far corner, I suddenly saw an outline. Someone crouched or hunched over. I gasped out loud then. Then the outline rose, and the figure turned to face me. Despite me shining my light right at it, I could not make out any details. It was like a living shadow, not a flesh and blood person. The figure took a single step forward, and my knees buckled. I was too terrified. I stumbled back, picked myself up, and desperately tried to open the door, which I don't remember shutting. Why would I have shut the door on myself in such a creepy room? I kept trying and trying harder and harder, and with a desperate pull, the door was torn open, the latch breaking off, bringing some of the door frame with it. I knew this might get me into trouble, but I didn't even care. Once that door was open, I sprinted back to the elevator. My nerve was done for. I didn't care if it was a ghost, some deranged person. I had to leave. At least get away from that floor. In the elevator, I was trembling with all the adrenaline flooding my body. Back in the lobby, I locked myself in the security office for the remainder of the shift. I didn't tell anyone what happened. I actually didn't get in trouble for the damaged door either. A couple of nights later, the building manager dropped by unexpectedly, around 2 a.m. He claimed to have forgotten something for work. We chatted briefly, and in a lapse of judgment, I mentioned that I felt weird about the 15th floor. He raised an eyebrow and looked curious, then told me, "You know, I've heard other guards say the same thing or similar things, that there's something mysterious about that floor." He didn't elaborate, and I didn't ask. He just gave me a nod that seemed loaded with unspoken understanding. Later that same night, camera 15 flickered again. I checked the monitor. I saw a door opening in the hallway, one that led to the final corner office. Then it shut by itself, because of course it did. The motion sensor beeped. My fingers shook as I watched. I kept debating in my head if I should go investigate or leave it alone. Ultimately, I decided to ignore it this time. I just couldn't do it again, at least not this soon. But apparently fate had other plans, because around 4, a fire alarm went off, specifically indicating the 15th floor. I cursed out loud. Building protocol demanded I check it out in person. I radioed for the fire department, but I had to confirm if there was an actual fire first, and if there was, I had to make sure there was no one left in there. I took the elevator up. My mind was really beating me up then, telling me how stupid I was to even consider going back to the 15th floor. When the elevator opened up, there was no smoke, which was a small blessing. I forced myself to hurry down the hallway, looking for any signs of a fire, but so far there were none. When I got to the vacant wing, the alarm lights were flashing on half-demolished walls. Stressed out, I started to grind my teeth, a habit I've always had and struggled with. I followed the signage to the control panel. The entire floor was suffused with that pulsing red glow again, making the shadows flicker ominously. When I got to the alarm panel, I found it ripped open. Wires dangled, like someone had forcibly yanked them. A shrieking beep echoed from further down the hallway, perhaps another panel. Over the cacophony, there was a distinct whisper. Not words, more like a hush, and I tried to ignore it, telling myself I was hearing things due to the already blaring sounds around me. But then something shot past the end of the hallway. A figure crossing from one room to another. My breath caught in my throat. I stood there only for a moment before I said literally out loud, "I'm not doing this," and noped it right back to the elevator. A few minutes after I got back in the lobby, the fire department showed up. They have to come even if they haven't had word from me yet. I let them know there was no sign of a fire, but that the panels had been damaged by someone. They went up, reset and repaired the system, confused about the tampering as well. They even did their own sweep up there, and didn't find any trace of a trespasser. Officially, they said it was just an alarm malfunction. But what kind of malfunction causes multiple panels to just burst? Out of fear of having to go back to the 15th floor, I decided to turn in my 2 weeks' notice. And for those 2 weeks, I did not go back to the 15th floor, no matter what I heard, no matter what I saw. I have no definitive explanation. Ghost, residual energy, something else that flourished in that neglected environment. But I do know a building like that is quite big, and all those labyrinthian hallways can conceal pretty much anything it wants. All it takes is a camera glitch or a flickering light, and your illusion of safety and normalcy can crumble. Working at a place like that, having a job like that, can make you go from a skeptic to a regular shaggy Norville Rogers. I don't even work security anymore. Too scared to do so. And I don't know about you, but I'd rather have a peaceful job that lets me sleep at night, rather than lying awake and wondering what kind of world we live in and what things lurk in the dark. As I was narrating these stories, I kept wondering, would you be willing to get fired from your job because you refuse to go to a certain place in your building that is very clearly haunted? I'd be handing my name tag right to the ghost. If they want to be jerks about it, they can just do my shift for me. I'll go home and be a telemarketer or something. That brings us to the end of this episode of Tales from the Break Room. I hope you enjoyed our stories. Let me know what scary work story topics you want to hear next. If you're on Spotify, don't forget you can comment below now. Support us by becoming a member at eeriecast.com/plus, which unlocks exclusive access to members-only content and more. Send us your story at eeriecast.com/plus and help us become the #1 scary podcast in the world by reviewing and following Tales from the Break Room on Spotify and Apple Podcasts. Thank you. Now it's time for me to clock out, but I'll be back, because Daddy needs that overtime pay.